B. F. Skinner. The B is for Burris and the F is for Frederick. Burris Frederick Skinner. Skinner was born in 1904 and is still very much alive. In fact, he can be considered the most famous, influential behaviorist alive today. He received his master's degree from Harvard in 1930 and his PhD also from Harvard in 1931. Incidentally, he received his BA degree from Hamilton College in New York. He taught at the University of Minnesota between 1936 and 1945 and went to the University of Indiana in 1945 as chairman of the psychology department. In 1948, he returned to Harvard, where he has been ever since. As we will see, Skinner's position is much like Thorndike after 1930, in that it emphasizes the effects of the consequences of a response on the response itself. And Skinner concludes that the effects of reward and punishment are not symmetrical. That is, reward changes the probability of a response, but punishment does not. And that, of course, is very similar, if not identical, to Thorndike's revised law of effect. Skinner's position is also much like Guthrie's, in that it's very simple, at least on the observational level. We saw that Guthrie, although his position sounded simple, was in fact more complicated than it sounded. Skinner's position both sounds simple and is simple. And again, like Guthrie, he places great emphasis on practical application. Through the years, Skinner has been a prolific and creative writer. He has tried to relate his laboratory findings to a number of human problems. His work has led to the development of programmed learning and to the development of teaching machines. A teaching machine is nothing more than a device used to present programmed learning. Two representative articles in this area would be The Science of Learning and the Art of Teaching, which he wrote in 1954. And he wrote an article called Teaching Machines in 1958. Following his own ideas on this particular issue, he wrote a program text along with Holland on his own theory. And this text was entitled The Analysis of Behavior, and it came out in 1961. In 1948, he wrote a utopian novel called Walden 2, the title paying tribute to Walden, written by Thoreau. Walden 2 attempts to utilize the principles of learning to the building of a model society. And reading this novel, Walden 2, is still a fairly good way to learn Skinner's position on learning. His writings have been extended to child development through the efforts of Bijou and Baer, who have written a book, a 2-volume book entitled Child Development. Bijou and Baer extended the basic Skinnerian notions to the area of child development. His thoughts have been extended to the area of personality through the writings of London, at least through London, along with a number of other people, who has written a book entitled Personality, a Behavioral Analysis. This is a very clear-cut attempt to apply basic Skinnerian notions to the whole complex topic of human personality. In addition, most students, in addition to these applications, most students of psychology are well aware of the widespread utilization of Skinnerian notions in the area of psychotherapy. For example, Lovas's early work with autistic children relied heavily on Skinner's work. Incidentally, there are many who believe the behavior modification approach, based on Skinner's ideas, is still the most effective way of working with autistic children or retarded children. And although we've used work with children here as an example, behavior modification, behavioral engineering, is by no means limited to children and has been used successfully on a variety of human problems such as adult stuttering and so forth. During the Second World War, Skinner even tried to use this theory in the area of national defense. He trained pigeons to peck at discs upon which moving pictures of enemy targets were being shown. The discs and the motion pictures being showed on them were contained in a glider loaded with high explosives, and the glider was called the Pelican. Thus the name of the article describing these events, Pigeons in a Pelican. As the pigeons pecked the targets, and the targets were moving, but the pigeons were trained to peck like a ship at sea, something like that. Their pecking closed various electronic circuits and thus kept the vehicle on target. This was supposed to be the American analogy of the Japanese kamikaze pilots without the loss of human life. When Skinner demonstrated his device, which he had perfected in a General Mills grain elevator in Minneapolis, this device, the work on this was done in Minneapolis in a General Mills grain elevator. When he demonstrated this to 12 distinguished scientists, they were amazed at the precision with which the pecking of the pigeons would keep the vehicle on target. But even after seeing this and even after their amazement, they decided to cut off all funds and the project was abandoned. Perhaps it has been speculated that perhaps they lost interest in this particular project because this group was well aware of the bomb that was to be dropped on Hiroshima, and this type of bomb, of course, alleviates the need for exact bombing. Now let's turn to Skinner's theory. Very early in his writing, Skinner distinguished two kinds of behavior. The first kind he called respondent behavior. Respondent behavior is behavior which is elicited by a known stimulus. Respondent behavior is elicited by a known stimulus. And the second kind of behavior is operant behavior. This is behavior that is not linked to a known stimulus, but rather looks as if it is simply emitted by the organism rather than elicited by a stimulus. It's behavior that is not tied to a known stimulus. So we say operant behavior is emitted rather than elicited. Along with these types of behavior, there are two types of conditioning. Type S conditioning is also called respondent conditioning. And an example would be classical conditioning, as we described it when we talked about Pavlov. It's called type S conditioning because of the emphasis on the stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus. The type of conditioning that corresponds to operant behavior is called type R conditioning because of the emphasis on the response rather than the stimulus. There are two general principles that are associated with type R conditioning, and they are as follows. Any response that is followed by a reinforcing stimulus tends to be repeated. And the second, a reinforcing stimulus is anything that increases the probability of a response. A reinforcing stimulus is anything that increases the probability of a response. The emphasis here in type R, or operant conditioning, is on the animal's behavior. He must act upon the environment in such a way as to produce the reinforcing stimulus. He must act upon the environment in such a way as to produce the reinforcing stimulus, or reward. Another word for reinforcing stimulus is reward. This is called contingent reinforcement, because with operant conditioning, getting the reward is contingent or depends upon a certain response on the part of the organism. Now, these very simple statements associated with type R, or operant conditioning, are extremely powerful statements and apply to a wide variety of events. Any living organism's behavior can be manipulated by applying these principles, including human behavior. The statement here says that if you want to modify or manipulate behavior, all that you need to do is find something that is rewarding for that organism, the organism whose behavior you want to modify in some way. You find something rewarding for that animal, and you simply wait until the desired behavior occurs, and then you reward it. You apply the reward. These statements say that when this is done, the probability of that response occurring again goes up, and when the response next occurs, you again reward it, the probability goes up further, and so forth. Now, this means any organism and any behavior that that organism is capable of performing. Now, a little thought, we'll talk about some extensions of these basic ideas, but essentially, that's the core of Skinner's position, and everything else emanates from these few comments. You can see the application here to the area of human personality. When these statements are applied to the complex behavior patterns that we call human personality, they say we are what we have been rewarded for being. This thing that we call personality, in a way, summarizes our reinforcement history. If our rewards had been different, then we would be quite different individuals. We learn English, if we have learned English, because we have been rewarded for approximating the sounds of the English language in our early home environment. If we happen to be in a Japanese home, or a Russian, some other language being spoken in our home, this is the language we would have learned, because when we approximated sounds in that language, we would have been attended to or rewarded in some other way. So these basic principles are used to explain persistent behavior patterns in all living organisms, including humans, and they're extended to the most complex human activities. Most of Skinner's work was done, most of his early animal work was done in a little test chamber which has come to be called the Skinner box. The Skinner box usually has a grid floor, transparent sides made of glass or plastic, a light, a lever or bar, and a food cup, and is arranged so that when the animal depresses the lever, a feeder mechanism is activated which causes a food pellet to be released into the food cup. And we'll talk about how the light is used in a moment or two. Now, Skinner had a special way of keeping track of the events that took place in the Skinner box. He used a cumulative recording. A cumulative recording is quite different from most ways of graphing data from a learning experiment. The cumulative recorder adds up responses as they're made. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis indicates total number of responses made. The cumulative recorder never goes down. The graph will never go back to the 0 point on the graph. It either climbs or it remains parallel to the x-axis. When the cumulative recording is generating a parallel line to the x-axis, this indicates no responding on the part of the organism. When the animal makes a response, the pen goes up a notch and remains at that level until the animal makes another response. So if there was an early response on the part of the organism when he's first placed into the Skinner box, the pen will go up a notch and remain there. There'll be a long, straight, parallel line to the x-axis until he makes another response. Now, if he responds very rapidly, then the line indicating the cumulative number of responses will rise very, very rapidly. So the rate of climb on the cumulative recording, the rate with which the line ascends, indicates the rate of responding on the part of the organism. A very steep line indicates very rapid responding, and a parallel line indicates no responding, so you can imagine all points in between. If at any time you wanted to know the total number of responses made by the animal, you just measure. One way of doing this is to measure the distance between where the line is at any given moment and the baseline, and this unit of measure will easily be transformed into the total number of responses. Now, the Skinner box is arranged, as we just mentioned, so that when the animal presses the bar, he receives a pellet of food. And according to the principles of operant conditioning, which incidentally, we mentioned the two kinds of conditioning. After making this distinction between type S and type R conditioning, or between respondent and operant conditioning, after making that initial distinction, Skinner has essentially worked on type R conditioning. He never has done work on type S. He's strictly an operant conditioning researcher. Okay, so when the bar is pressed, the bar press response is rewarded and is therefore learned. And this has been demonstrated in a wide variety of circumstances, some of which we have already mentioned. Another example would be an experiment by Greenspoon, who is a clinical psychologist, a non-directive clinical psychologist, which meant that he offered nothing to his patient during a therapeutic session except maybe an or something like this. The commitment of the non-directive therapist is to allow the patient to gain insight into his own problem So the attempt on the part of the therapist is to remain as aloof or independent from the problem itself as possible. So there was a widespread practice among client-centered or non-directive therapists to listen to what a patient was saying and periodically saying mm-hmm, mm-hmm, indicating an interest and an understanding, but not offering anything beyond that. Well, Greenspoon hypothesized that perhaps in this very anxiety-provoking situation that the patient is in, anything at all that the therapist does could, in fact, act as a reinforcer. So to test this notion, Greenspoon arranged the situation so that every time the patient said a plural noun, Greenspoon said, mm-hmm. And the effect of this was the same as a rat receiving a pellet of food after making a bar press. The cumulative recording in the Greenspoon experiment showing the increased frequency of emitting plural nouns when the therapist began to say mm-hmm following each plural noun was identical, almost identical in shape to the cumulative recording generated by a rat learning a bar press in a Skinner box. A man named Verplanck did the very same thing with opinionated statements on the part of students. He said to the students, your job is to work for points. Every time I tap my pencil on the table, you have received a point. Please keep track of your own points. Now, with these very simple instructions, every time the student made an opinionated statement, he received a point, and Verplanck found the same increased frequency of emitting opinionated statements when they were rewarded. And most of the subjects in the Verplanck experiment, by far most of the subjects, were totally unaware of the relationship between opinionated statements on their part and the receiving of points from the experimenter. Now, the process that we've been describing so far of operant conditioning takes some time. If you were interested in bringing about a bar press response from an albino rat, one way to do it is to put an animal in the Skinner box and arrange it like we have described, and simply to leave. Hook up some kind of recording device, and every now and then check to see if the animal has learned the bar press. And under these conditions, he either learns or dies. If he doesn't learn the bar press, he dies of starvation. Another way to do the same thing is to apply the same principles of operant conditioning in a slightly different way. This time we'll add one more piece of apparatus to the Skinner box, and that is a hand switch, which externally activates the feeder mechanism. You have the switch in your hand, and you can fire the feeder mechanism when you want it to be fired, regardless of what the animal is doing. Now, you, in your imagination, divide the Skinner box into half. And you say that you will reward the animal with a pellet of food when he is in the half of the Skinner box containing the lever. Now the same principles apply. When he's rewarded for being in that half of the Skinner box, he tends to remain in that half of the Skinner box. Now that you have his behavior concentrated closer to the bar, you become a little more strict. Now you say that you will only reward him when he's even closer to the bar, and not when he's toward the middle of the cage. And you withhold your reinforcement until he's in the vicinity of the bar. Now you reward him, and he remains in the vicinity of the bar. Now you become even more strict and you say that you won't reward him until he's touching the bar. And when he touches the bar, you reward him. He tends to touch the bar again, and now you say, well, you won't reward him until he's putting pressure on the bar. And very soon he's pressing the bar, you put down the hand switch, and he's doing it all himself. Now, this process is very similar to a game that many children play called You're Hot, You're Cold, where they hide something in a room, and then they bring in a playmate, and the playmate looks for what they have hid. And as they get closer to the object, the person says, you're getting warmer, you're warmer, you're warmer, you're on fire, you're boiling hot, so forth. As they get farther away, you say you're getting colder, colder, and colder. Well, this game, when it's played with a rat, is called shaping. You have shaped the bar press response in this case. Rather than waiting for it to happen, you have shaped it into existence, which is a much more rapid process than merely waiting for it. Shaping has two components. The first component is differential reinforcement, which simply means that you reinforce some responses and not others. And the second component is successive approximation, which refers to the fact that you wait until the animal gets closer and closer to what you want him to do before rewarding him. Successive approximation. In this case, first you settle for being in the right half of the Skinner box, or the correct half, the half with the lever, and then closer to the bar, touching the bar. So you successively approximate the bar press response through differential reinforcement, and these two taken together define what we refer to as shaping. A moment ago we talked about contingent reinforcement, and the example we just gave was an example of contingent reinforcement. Reward or reinforcement is contingent upon the bar press. But what would happen if it wasn't? What would happen if we arranged the feeder mechanism to fire independent of the animal's behavior? Every now and then we had a timing device, and every now and then we arranged it so the feeder mechanism delivered a pellet of food regardless of what the animal is doing. What would happen? Well, again, apply the principles of operant conditioning to this situation, and think about what is happening to the animal under these conditions. Whatever he's doing when the feeder mechanism is activated is what he will be rewarded for doing. And because he has been rewarded for doing it, regardless of what it is, that behavior will tend to be repeated. And when it's repeated, eventually the feeder mechanism, again at random, will fire again, and that behavior pattern will gain in strength. The probability of it happening again will go up. And when he performs that activity, whatever it is, eventually the feeder mechanism will fire again, and that habit or that behavior pattern will reoccur quite frequently under these conditions. But note that whatever the animal is doing, it could be turning in a circle or bobbing his head up and down, a variety of things. Whatever he's doing is independent of whether or not he receives a pellet of food. Another way of saying that is that he will receive a pellet of food whether or not he engages in this behavior. So we refer to this behavior as superstitious. This is superstitious behavior because the animal looks as if he believes that what he's doing is causing a pellet of food to occur. And superstitious behavior comes about through non-contingent reinforcement. The reinforcement is not contingent upon the animal's behavior, so it is referred to as non-contingent reinforcement, and it results in superstitious behavior. Now, we said that the animal looks as if he believes that what he's doing is causing a pellet of food to occur. When we attribute these beliefs and attitudes and so forth to a lower animal, we are guilty of what is referred to as anthropomorphism, attributing man-like characteristics to non-human animals. Anthropomorphism. You can think, I'm sure, of numerous examples of superstitious behavior on the part of humans. Organized sports is filled with examples. Imagine what happens to the baseball player, for example, who after stepping to the plate adjusts his hat in a certain way, and the very next pitch he hits out of the ballpark. There'll be a strong tendency on the part of that ball player to adjust his hat in a similar way next time he's at the plate, and so forth. Another thing we can refer to at this point is the process by which a response can take on the ability to signal another response. An animal, in this case, in the Skinner box case, makes a bar press response and receives a pellet of food. Well, the response of eating the food or consuming the pellet can act as a signal for the animal to make the next response. For example, going back to the bar and pressing it, or doing something else before he goes back to the bar. Now, when a response acts not only as a response, but also as a cue to some other response, and these things are linked together in this way, we call this chaining. We call it behavioral chaining, where one response acts not only as a response, but as a cue to either the person's next or the organism's next response, or it acts as a cue for someone else's response. For example, sitting down at the dinner table and seeing something you want is a cue for asking for it. But your response of asking for the potatoes or the meat, whatever, is a signal for someone else who is hearing your response to, in fact, reach over and pass them. So your response acts as a cue, and then the person responding to you by passing whatever you asked for, his response not only is reinforcing your request for the meat. Let's say you saw the meat and you said to someone, "Pass the meat, please." Now that's your operant response, pass the meat. But in addition to being an operant response, it's a signal for the listener to pick up the meat and pass it to you. And that's his operant response. But his operant response of passing you the meat is the reward for your initial response of saying, "Pass the meat," and so forth. These behaviors are linked together in a chain-like sequence, and we refer to that as chaining. We'll talk in more detail about this thing that we call a signal or a cue from the Skinnerian point of view in just a moment. Now, as with classical conditioning, when we remove the reward from operant conditioning, we get extinction. We have it arranged now so that when the animal presses the bar, he gets a pellet of food, and we note that he very rapidly learns the bar press and persists in pressing the bar until he's satiated with food. If we disconnected the feeder mechanism under these conditions, we note that gradually the cumulative recording becomes shallower and shallower and eventually becomes parallel to the baseline, indicating no responding. And we say that extinction has occurred. The rate of pressing the bar goes back to the level it was at before we introduced reward. Now that doesn't mean the animal will never press the bar, and it doesn't mean that the animal never would have pressed the bar before we introduced reward. There's always some baseline corresponding to the response we're looking at. And this baseline indicates the rate with which the response occurs naturally in the environment or in the life of the organism without introducing reward. We call this the operant level for that response. And if we remove reward from the situation, the response goes back to its operant level. And as with classical conditioning, we find spontaneous recovery in operant conditioning. That is, after extinction, if we remove the animal from the Skinner box, put him back in his home cage for a period of time, and then bring him back without any further training, and again, place him in the Skinner box, he will begin to press the bar for a short period of time, and we refer to this as spontaneous recovery. Now let's go back to the Skinner box and talk about the light that we referred to earlier. After we have conditioned the animal to press the bar in order to receive food, we can change the rules and make them a little bit more tricky. We can arrange the situation so that a bar press activates the feeder mechanism only when that light in the Skinner box is on, and a bar press when the light is off results in nothing. Under these conditions, we refer to the light as an SD, or a discriminative stimulus. The light on condition is the SD condition, and the light off condition is the S delta condition. Again, when the animal presses the bar when the light is on, he receives a reward. When he presses the bar with the light off, he receives nothing. Under these conditions, the animal learns to press the bar when the light is on and not to press the bar when the light is off. So we say that the light has become a cue or a signal for the bar press response. When the light comes on, the animal presses the bar. Now, there's some similarity here between operant conditioning, or what we have now is a discriminative operant. An operant response given selectively to one set of circumstances and not to another set of circumstances. This is a discriminative operant. And there is some similarity between the discriminative operant and respondent behavior. But the similarity is only slight, because you'll remember that with respondent behavior, the response is elicited by a stimulus that has a natural association with the response, like food powder and the hungry dog causes salivation. That the food powder actually elicits automatically and naturally the response of salivation. In the case of the discriminative operant, the light becomes the occasion for the response. It's a signal indicating to the organism that a certain response is now appropriate. As you're driving down the street, you see a red light, and the red light acts as an SD or a cue for you to stop, which is your operant response. So the SD leads to the response, and the reward for the response is not getting a ticket or not getting in an accident, not receiving bodily injury, and so forth. If you see someone that you would just as soon avoid, walking in such a way as that his path would intercept yours if you continued with yours, then the sight of that person could act as an SD or a cue for you to change your path. And by changing your path, you avoid the person, which is the reward for the response. So now you have three components with the discriminative operant. You have a signal, a response, and then a reinforcing stimulus or a reward. Because any neutral stimulus that is paired with a reward takes on rewarding properties. Because any neutral stimulus paired with a reward takes on rewarding properties. This is the principle of secondary reinforcement. It follows that every SD must be a secondary reinforcer. Now, in the case of the light, let's arrange the situation a little bit differently. Let's say that during training, when the animal presses the bar, the light in the Skinner box comes on. Every time he presses the bar, the light in the Skinner box comes on. And now, this pairing occurs always during acquisition of the bar press response. Bar press, light, food, so forth. Now, according to the principle here of secondary reinforcement, the light is being paired with the presence of reward, and it should take on rewarding properties of its own. Now, to test this notion, one way to test this notion is to put the animal in extinction, under extinction conditions, and in fact extinguish the bar press response only without the light. We disconnect the feeder mechanism, and he presses the bar, and he gets neither the light nor does he receive food, and he extinguishes, or almost extinguishes, let's say in this case. His rate of responding is very, very low. Now we arrange the situation still during extinction so that when he presses the bar, the light goes on, but he still receives no food. Under these conditions, what happens is the rate of responding again goes up fairly high, and all he's receiving is the light. He's still not receiving the food. So we say that the light has in fact taken on rewarding properties because it alone has maintained the bar press response. In addition to maintaining the bar press response, we can in fact train another response using the light once it has taken on reward properties. It doesn't need to be used only to maintain the response of pressing the bar. But once it takes on rewarding properties through its association with primary reinforcement, it can be used as a generalized reinforcer. Generalized reinforcer. It can be used to reward any number of responses. To summarize Skinner's position on rewards, we have, first of all, primary positive reinforcement. This is something that is naturally rewarding to the organism, like food or water, sex, and so forth. Anything associated with primary positive reinforcement takes on positive secondary reinforcing characteristics. A positive reinforcer, either primary or secondary, is something which, when added to the situation, something which, when given to the organism, it increases the probability of a response. In other words, if you give positive reinforcement following a response, it increases the probability of that response reoccurring. A negative reinforcer is something which, when taken away or removed from the situation, increases the probability of a response. An example of a negative reinforcer might be an aversive sound, a very high-pitched tone occurring inside of a Skinner box, and when the animal presses the bar or the lever, it prevents the tone from occurring. Under these circumstances, the tone would be a negative reinforcer because its removal, its termination, would increase the probability of that response occurring. So, reinforcement consists of either giving someone something he wants, or taking away something he does not want. Each one of those would increase the probability of a response reoccurring. Punishment is either taking away something someone wants, or giving him something he does not want. Either of those two would define punishment. So either taking away what is positively reinforcing to an organism, or applying a negative reinforcer. The administration of a negatively reinforcing stimulus would constitute punishment. Skinner reaches the same conclusion concerning the effectiveness of punishment as did Thorndike. That is, it doesn't work. It does not decrease the probability of a response over a long period of time. At best, punishment represses or suppresses a response, but it does not weaken the habit. A typical experiment which led Skinner to this conclusion involves training some rats to press the bar in a Skinner box. And after they've been thoroughly trained, take one group of rats and arrange the situation so that when a member from this group presses the bar during extinction, not only will he not get a pellet of food, which is the normal case during extinction, but he, in addition to this, will receive a rather severe shock through the bar. In other words, now a shock will be contingent upon pressing of the bar. The other group will undergo regular extinction. That is, the fear mechanism is merely discontinued, and they simply do not receive a reward for pressing the bar. After the first experimental session, after the first extinction session, it's typically found that the shocked group, or the punished group, has emitted far fewer responses before they finally extinguish than does the non-shocked or non-punished group. If you look at the cumulative recordings, you would see that the tapering off, or the fact that the cumulative graph becomes parallel to the baseline for the punished group, this occurs much more rapidly than it does for the non-punished group. So if you just looked at that much data, you would conclude that in fact punishment was effective in bringing about a more rapid extinction of an undesired habit. However, if we take the animals out of the apparatus and wait for a period of time, and then put them back in the apparatus, which defines the conditions under which spontaneous recovery is tested, we find that the previously punished group of animals has a greater burst of responding during spontaneous recovery than does the non-punished group. And after the second experimental session, we note that they have made approximately the same number of total responses to extinction. So the punished group during the second extinction session catches up in total number of responses to extinction to the non-punished group. So in a long run, simply non-reward is as effective in extinguishing a habit as non-reward plus punishment. This has profound implications for a variety of things. For example, child rearing, penal institutions, and the control of human behavior in general. Skinner is saying that if you don't want a response to occur, the best thing to do is to ignore it. And he's saying something in addition to that. He's saying if behavior reoccurs, then it's legitimate to look for a reinforcing agent supporting that behavior. And if you don't want the behavior to occur, locate the reinforcing agent or agents and arrange for them not to be contingent upon that behavior. Now notice, to bring about extinction, we need the response to occur and not to be reinforced. In other words, the mere passage of time is not enough to extinguish a response. It must occur and be not rewarded in order to have its probability of reoccurrence reduced. As a matter of fact, there have been very extensive periods of time pass between when an animal has learned a complex skill and when it has been tested on this skill, and the memory for the task is phenomenal. In the article we mentioned earlier in this discussion, called Pigeons and a Pelican, the pigeons that Skinner trained to peck the very complex target on the disc in the glider, named the pelican, were removed from the apparatus following training and after the funds had been discontinued, and moved back to their quarters, to the living quarters, and were maintained for years as breeders, and were given no opportunity to rehearse this very complicated skill that they had learned. Years after their training, they were put back in the apparatus and performed with perfection in almost every case, indicating again that mere passage of time is not enough to extinguish a habit. There must be non-reinforced practice for this to occur. Probably Skinner's most impressive contribution to learning theory has been his work on schedules of reinforcement. This is unique with Skinner and did not occur in Thorndike's early work at all. The psychological world was rather startled when Humphreys, in 1939, found that the extinction process was more rapid following 100% reinforcement than after partial reinforcement. That is, if an animal received a pellet of food, for example, every time he made a bar press response during acquisition, during the learning phase of an experiment, and then he was switched to complete non-reinforcement, his trials to criterion during extinction, the speed with which this bar press response was extinguished for him, would be greater, in other words, more rapid, than an animal who was only reinforced for a bar press response some of the time during acquisition. Partial reinforcement leads to greater resistance to extinction than continuous or 100% reinforcement. That's a general rule, and this is referred to as the partial reinforcement effect. Skinner studied this effect extensively and eventually wrote a book with Foerster called Schedules of Reinforcement. And this book summarized many years of research on various types of partial reinforcement. 5 schedules of reinforcement have become the most popular, and these are as follows: 100% reinforcement, which is rewarding every response. And incidentally, it is the schedule that precedes the 4 schedules that we'll be talking about here. In other words, an animal is first trained on a 100% reinforcement schedule and then is switched to one of the others, because it's very difficult to bring about acquisition of any response using a partial reinforcement schedule. The second popular reinforcement schedule is referred to as fixed interval reinforcement schedule. Using a fixed interval reinforcement schedule, the animal is reinforced for a response made only after a set interval of time. For example, the response following a 3-minute interval is reinforced. So every 3 minutes, when the animal makes the response at the end of that interval, that response and only that response is reinforced. 3 minutes is an arbitrary figure. It could be after 30 seconds, after a minute, after 5 minutes, and so forth, just so the interval is fixed. Now, note the animal still must make the response. It's not non-contingent reinforcement, as we talked about earlier. It's contingent reinforcement. The animal must respond, but only that response corresponding to the termination of that interval is reinforced. The third kind of scheduled reinforcement is fixed ratio reinforcement. And this occurs when the nth response that the animal makes is rewarded. For example, every 5th response is rewarded. Here, the important factor determining reward is not the passage of time, but the number of responses made. Theoretically, with the fixed interval schedule, if the animal somehow could know that he was on a 3-minute schedule, fixed interval schedule, he could make just one response during each 3-minute session and be rewarded. With the fixed ratio schedule, however, this is not possible. The animal must respond X number of times before he's rewarded. Both the fixed interval and the fixed ratio reinforcement schedule produce a stepwise cumulative recording. That is, there's a depression in the rate of responding following each reward. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why this might be. Perhaps the most reasonable explanation is that the animal learns that he's never rewarded following a reward, that responses following a reward in each of these two types of schedules is never rewarded. So there's a tapering off and then a building up prior to when the next reinforcement is going to come. And the scalloping or stepwise phenomenon develops more vividly over time as the animal kind of learns what's happening in the situation. If you want to equate these two kinds of schedules to the human level, you might say that fixed interval reinforcement is like being a salary, a weekly salary, that your paycheck comes at the end of the week. It's roughly analogous, not quite. And fixed ratio would be doing piecework, that you get paid by the number of bushels of apricots or apples or whatever. Pick. The fourth schedule is referred to as variable interval. And this is when the animal gets rewarded after an average time interval. That is, rather than having a fixed interval of time, he's rewarded on the average of every 3 minutes, say. But he may be rewarded twice in a row, or he may be rewarded after 30 seconds or after 7 minutes. A number of time intervals will go by before he is rewarded. This kind of schedule eliminates the scalloping or stepwise way of responding. It's just a straight burst of responding at a very, very rapid rate. The fifth kind of schedule is variable ratio. And again, it's like the fixed ratio, except that the animal is rewarded on the average of every 5 responses. So he might have 2 rewards in a row, or he might have to go 10, 15 responses without being rewarded. Both variable interval and variable ratio schedules of reinforcement produce extremely high rates of responding during acquisition and very high resistance to extinction. So to summarize, continuous reinforcement yields the least resistance to extinction. It's the schedule that produces the most rapid extinction. And all partial reinforcement schedules produce greater resistance to extinction than continuous reinforcement. But of the partial reinforcement schedules that we have mentioned here, variable interval and variable ratio schedules produce the greatest resistance to extinction. To summarize Skinner's position, he believes in a close to the data approach to experimentation. His approach has always been to manipulate certain environmental events and to note the effect of this manipulation on some measurable aspect of behavior. He believes that the main concepts in psychology should be operationally defined, in other words, defined in such a way as to allow the concepts to be measured. And an example of this would be his concept of drive. He notes that high drive produces greater activity, more bar pressing. But he defines drive in terms of a set of operations. He operationally defines drive in terms of the number of hours of deprivation. Hunger drive is defined in terms of hours since the animal has eaten. And as this number of hours goes up, presumably the hunger drive goes up, but he doesn't take that last step. To him, drive is hours of deprivation. That's an example of his operational approach.
He does not believe it is necessary to formulate complicated theories to account for these events, nor is it necessary to know what is physiologically or anatomically behind these events. His approach has been characterized as the empty organism approach. He could care less about what goes on in the organism. His approach is to do a functional analysis between stimulating events and measurable behavior. He wrote a very profound article on the topic entitled, "Are Theories of Learning Necessary?" And he says that perhaps someday psychology might benefit from theory, but first, like any science, we need to make more basic observations. We need some subject matter first, and then we could become a little more tricky in the future. In accordance with these ideas, Skinner's research is not guided by theoretical formulations, but rather his approach has been a hit and miss process. He tries first one thing and then another. If he sees something isn't working, he'll shift to something that looks more fruitful in a trial and error fashion. This rather nonchalant attitude toward scientific investigation is summarized in his article entitled "A Case Study in Scientific Method," where he describes his version, his interpretation of what scientific research should be like. Again, there is nothing in Skinner that anyone needs to take on faith. His ideas can be verified by anyone. And because they are at the same time simple and powerful, everyone probably should make an attempt to verify these notions for himself. Remember, to be a behavior modifier, all you need is a living organism, something that you feel will reward that particular organism. Arrange this situation so that the response you want to occur can be seen and detected, and when it occurs, administer the reward, and you will see, according to Skinner's position, a rather rapid increase in the rate with which that particular response occurs. Now, for those of you with some imagination, the possibilities are unlimited. So you're urged to go forth and modify someone's behavior.